Okay, I want to talk about today something that when I was sitting in the seats that you're sitting in, I didn't hear about it. If I did hear about it, I was asleep or I missed that week or whatever. And it's really kind of a testimonial to how you have great plans and they don't work out that way. Because my expectation was probably like some of you, all of you in graduate school, I would leave here and I would hire on someplace, government, university, or whatever, and I would do research on whatever my favorite topic was, and I would publish in the peer-reviewed literature, and I'd live happily ever after, and I'd become the world's experts on, Eastern Oregon earthworms, or, the river flow in, so-and-so creek in eastern Nevada, something like this. It didn't work out that way. Things came out very differently. Relatively early on, I found myself in situations like this, presenting science to groups of people who weren't cheerleaders. In fact, they were hanging on my every word, looking how they could undermine what I was going to say, how I had stepped over the line into policy advocacy, how I was going to ruin their life, push them off the land, cause the extinction of wild salmon and other kinds of things. And frankly, I wasn't prepared for that. I was the expert on my technical thing, but I didn't know diddly about how policy worked. And today I want to give you a few lessons learned along those lines. First of all, what is a scientist? I'll talk just very briefly about that. And more importantly, I'll talk about what is an ethical role for a scientist, particularly if you're in the public sector like federal or state or local government, but I think it applies to anybody that gets public funds. What is a scientist? Is it somebody who has an academic degree in science, somebody who thinks like a scientist, somebody who calls himself a scientist? Several people in Congress call themselves scientists. Are they scientists? I would argue here that I'm going to use a very narrow definition of scientist, and it's one that you keep in mind. It's not the right definition or the wrong one, but it's the one I'm going to use. And that is, a scientist is a person who generates or interprets scientific information or science. That's it. You may have a degree in science, but unless you're a practicing scientist, you're not going to be a scientist the way I call it here. Okay? Nothing wrong with that. You may have a degree in teaching, but unless you're teaching, you're not a teacher. Okay, second point. What is an ethical role for a scientist? Those of us who work in government or used to work in government, what's an ethical role? Well, the code of conduct is there for federal employees and state employees, and lots of other folks, all professional societies have these. And essentially, I could paraphrase these by saying, don't lie, cheat, and steal. Okay? And let me give you a breadth of insight here. That's not a high bar to clear. It's not easy to do. It's not easy to do in some obscure situations, but in general, the codes of conduct are pretty low in terms of ethical requirement. Don't cheat on your voucher, and don't take money on the side, et cetera, et cetera. But for an agency of science, the challenge that you'll have, assuming you can clear this bar, will be much more difficult. Because looking at an ethical role for a scientist, working as a scientist in an agency, is much more nuanced. And I'll make the case how it's nuanced and offer you my view of how to survive. Well, why? Hey, if you're going to be the world's expert on earthworms, why do you need to know this kind of stuff? Chances are, when you go out and work for an agency, you'll be working on ecological problems that people care about. It's going to affect them. Your science will be crucial. And people will hang on the kinds of results that you find. Let's talk about some examples. Let's go down to California. We've got the worst drought in California since the 1930s. And coming into work today, I heard Governor Schwarzenegger say, we have got to build some dams to store this runoff that we have in the spring. We've got plenty of water. It's just not spread around during the calendar year. We need to do this. People in LA, Southern California, are saying the farmers in the Central Valley who are withering away are saying, we better get cracking on this. It's a critical problem. But wait. We've got listed salmon in the Central Valley of California, Endangered Species Act. We've got the Delta smelt, which very much constrain the kind of things you can do. You've got a group of people, largely the urban folks in San Francisco, associated environmentalists, are saying, no way, Jose, you're not building dams. Imagine if you were the scientist assessing, among other things, what are going to be the ecological consequences of building those dams. Everybody would be interested in what you find, and depending on their policy position, they would be probably out to undermine the validity of your science. So that's the context. Forget about publishing in a peer-reviewed literature when you deal with policy problems like this, at least in the short term. They want your results like yesterday, preferably the day before yesterday. We're not going to wait around until you get the stuff published. Give us the results as soon as possible. Second example, near and dear to my heart. We spend billions of dollars a year trying to bring back wild salmon runs in the Pacific Northwest and the Central Valley in California. Lots of money. Next time you fly in a SeaTac, look at the backup of planes. They've got 2 runways. Weather's bad. They've got a serious problem. The demand on the runways is very great. And if you know where SeaTac's located, the only place you can stretch out a runway is into the water, which is habitat for salmon, which happened to be listed. So here in this example, the folks doing the science there had basically competing policy objectives. Lots of folks wanted the runway built because of these types of problems and safety problems. Lots of other folks wanted the salmon protected. Those scientists were in the spotlight. Their results were scrutinized. Let's use a third example. Everybody wants alternative energy. Here we have windmills, the great source of energy. The President and Congress has said by next year, 2010, we're going to pour enough money into this to have 5% of our energy sources, our supply coming from windmills. A couple of problems. First problem is they kill a lot of birds and bats, and there's some constituencies out there that don't like that. A lot of those are listed. Some are listed under Migratory Bird Treaty. It's against the law to kill them. Others aren't listed under Endangered Species Act. In addition to that, all the easy places already have windmills. All the farms in North Dakota and places where people are paid to put windmills on their farm, they have that. But unfortunately, these make a nasty sound. The best example is basically if you throw a tennis shoe in your dryer and look at that, you listen to that 24/7, and you're not getting paid to listen to it, you're saying you're not a good neighbor. So the result of this is, let's look at the national forest. Essentially no one lives there. It's public land. Maybe that's where we could put these windmills, windmill farms. And of course you can figure there's going to be the predictable opposition. Now think about the folks doing science to assess the consequences, ecological consequences of putting these wind farms on public lands. People from the White House call and say, what do you find and how's it look? This is front and center. You can't hide in the corner and say, hey, I haven't finished a journal article, it won't be published for a few years, hang loose. Not going to work. Okay, and there's lots of others. So if you think you'll escape these, you must be independently wealthy. I will guess that in your career, probably a substantial part of it will be working on problems like this, where people really care about the policy implications. Okay, let's look at some facts about policy. And we can think of these 3 examples. First, the issues are complex. They're not simple. They've got short and long-term ramifications. And they're thorny politically. Now, what does thorny mean to a political scientist? It's a technical term. Politicians don't like them. They don't want to make choices. Why don't they want to make a choice in California? Because they're going to alienate about half their constituency. Why don't they want to make a choice in salmon recovery? It's because about half the population says, no way, Jose, no matter what you choose. And so they're going to avoid, to the extent possible, making tough policy choices if it's going to alienate a large amount of the folks who might vote for them. And let's look at the general public. General public says, I really think that you technical experts, you scientists ought to make these questions, because who knows anything about the consequences of dam construction? Who knows anything about the consequences ecologically of windmill farms? Who knows about, salmon next to SeaTac? These are technical questions. You decide. But of course, if you make a decision, they say, what gives you the right as a technical expert to locate a wind farm next to me? What gives you the right to say that I've got to fly into SeaTac and take my life in hand because you're trying to protect a salmon? Or the flip side is, what gives you the right to say you can pour concrete and riprap into salmon habitat and think you can get away with it? So the public is conflicted. For scientists, there's an ongoing debate over the proper or ethical role of science. Some people at one extreme would take the view is, we are the technical experts on these topics, therefore we ought to make those choices. At the other extreme, people will say, well, actually most policy choices are only partially about science. They're mostly about competing values and policy preferences, and therefore you people ought to have a very, very narrow role in them. Don't call us, we'll call you. Okay, let's talk about you specifically. Imagine you leave here, OSU, degree in hand, you hire on someplace, and you're either one of two people, and you'll likely be one of two people during your career. The person in pink, you're likely to be later in your career. That's a user of science. That's a policy maker or perhaps a policy analyst. Somebody who takes the science along with all other kinds of information, which we'll talk about, and makes a policy decision or perhaps a policy recommendation. More likely, early in your career, you'll be a person with the yellow circle, a provider of science, somebody who's going to give policymakers, give policy analysts the best available science on a particular topic. And I'll approach this seminar as if you're the person in yellow providing science. Two things to keep in mind. Follow the code of conduct from your professional society or your agency. Don't lie, cheat, and steal. Okay? We'll assume you've done that. In my experience, in a long time doing this, that's really pretty accurate. I mean, most people are very, on those kinds of issues, they're very straightforward and clear-cut, and I don't really think that's a big issue. The greater challenge is, how do you provide science in an ethically reasonable way? And that's what I'll talk about from now on. We're going to use a lot of terms. And these terms are defined differently. Common words defined uncommonly. So a lot of the debates that you hear and you read in the literature are about debates over definitions. So rather than have those debates, I'm going to give you mine. First one, about policy, of value. And let's use the example of conflicting moral positions. This is the toughest part of both analysis, policy analysis, and policy making, because these are usually mutually exclusive. And here's two examples of moral positions, very practical ones. On the left, we have a group of people who take the moral position that it's morally wrong to drive a species to extinction. It is wrong. You shouldn't do it. I don't care what the consequences are. It's just not morally acceptable. On the right side, we have another moral position, which basically says, it's my property. I bought it. I paid for it. I pay taxes on it. I have not only a legal obligation to this property, I have a moral obligation. And so when you clowns over here on this side say that you have got to protect the stream because it's spawning habitat, that's my backyard. If you want it, you pay me fair market value, and I may not even be willing to sell it to you. Now these tend to be, moral issues, value conflicts tend to be mutually exclusive. You can't create win-win solutions here. No matter which way you go, somebody's going to be very unhappy. So that's a value, a core belief that tends to determine or shape personal or group policy preference, a very critical point in policy. A preference. A preference really is just your choice among competing alternatives. We all make preferences. You know, we buy a car or a truck or something. Those are preferences. You need transportation. You buy one of those or a bike or something else. Outdoor recreation. Here are two extremes in outdoor recreation. We have about 4 or 5, 6 people up there in a mountain lake having a good time with aquatic recreation and so forth. What they don't show you here are the mosquitoes and so forth, but it sure looks like a good place. And then we have another one on the right, a similar aquatic experience. Which is better? Neither is better. They're just policy preferences. These are choices people make. Okay? Policy. What is a policy? A policy is nothing, a very simple concept, nothing but a decision or course of action designed to accomplish a desired output. That's the crucial point. Policy has to have a goal, an output, something at the end. It can be simple, like we're going to go forth and do good and protect the environment, in this case, or it can be extremely complicated. Here's 400 pages in great detail how we're going to protect the environment, and we've defined very clearly what the environment is. Advocacy, policy advocacy. Nothing more than active support for a particular policy or class of policy. Let's talk about the wind farm. Policy advocates can either take very much the view of protesting, as these folks are protesting here, or through the normal bureaucratic governmental process, various factions can argue for their particular policy preference. Either build it here, not there, and so forth. So that's an example of policy advocacy. Nothing wrong with it. That's the nature of government. Politics. I mean, how many here have a good feeling of politics? Like, none, okay? But politics really is just the process of debate, negotiation, and compromise to achieve a desired policy goal. It's the way we make decisions in a democracy. It's like sausage, you know. It may taste great at the end of the day, but no one wants to see how it was made. Same thing with politics. You know, it's a messy process. Here we have an example of healthcare, and the politics can be either informally here or individual advocacy groups making their pitch to a legislature or somebody else. It's the way it is. Science. What is science? I'm defining science as a type of information, only a type. There's lots of other kinds of information in science. It's information that's gathered in a rational, systematic, and reproducible manner. That's really the key. Other people could go out, they understand your methods, and if they did the same thing exactly, they'd come out with approximately the same result. Of course, there's variation and different interpretations, but it's not like there's no reference to divine or faith or anything else. This is reproducible stuff. And if you're looking at the consequences of a dam, you know, we all, given the similar expertise in science, would approach it approximately in the same way. Not exactly, but in general, scientists tend to approach problems, isolate variables, and control, and so forth. Scientist, reiterate my definition, fairly narrow, somebody who's actually generating or interpreting science. You might be the bench scientist here, or in the field that's actually doing the hands-on work, or you might be the person who synthesizes the science and presents it to policymakers or the public. Either way, operating as a scientist. Okay, what is the proper and ethical role of a government scientist? And this is my opinion. I don't want you to adopt my opinion. What I want you to do is look at the way I came at this problem after a long career, and you figure out how you're going to approach this problem. And you ought to do it before you get into a situation where you have to. Okay, first, admonition. If you're paid for by the taxpayers as a government scientist, is be involved. I don't hold the view that as a scientist you sit in your laboratory, generate your stuff, and then periodically you publish it as a journal article, and you know, if the politicians or others wanted your stuff, they can read the literature. I don't hold with that. That might be okay if you're independently wealthy, but it's not okay if the taxpayers are paying your salary. But even though I say that you ought to contribute to both analysis and policy implementation, I think you should do it in a very defined and clear-cut role. Play this appropriate role. It doesn't give you free lunch to go out there and do all kinds of things, and I'll talk about what I think you should and shouldn't do. Okay, what you should not do. What you should not do. First, I don't think as a scientist, especially for a government scientist, you should not be an explicit advocate for or against a policy. By explicit, I mean that it's publicly known, it's clear-cut, you're arguing for a policy, you're using things like ought, we should build this dam, we should remove this dam, we should build a runway, we shouldn't build a runway. That's advocacy. You're taking a policy position. In my view, inappropriate for a scientist to do that. Secondly, and the one I'll spend most of the time is, don't be an implicit advocate. This is the worst sin in my view. This is a sin, this is a bad sin, this is a cardinal sin. This one says people don't know you're advocating. You're either consciously or unconsciously tricking them into thinking you're providing policy-neutral science, when in fact you're really providing science that will lead them to a particular policy preference. Okay, let's go back to the first one. I argue that you shouldn't be an explicit policy advocate, several reasons. First is, I think it's impossible for anybody, but particularly a scientist, to compartmentalize. You can't have a day job where you're supposed to be policy neutral, but in the evening you're out arguing for a particular policy. I just don't think people can compartmentalize that way. You've got to train yourself to think here, hey, it's a democracy, my values are no more important than anybody else's, I'll provide the science, that's what I'm paid to do. Good democratic decision-making needs trusted scientists. How corny can you be? I mean, I'm kind of a small c, civil servant. Scientists, politicians, all have roles. Politicians need to go to government scientists and say, tell me what the consequence of this dam will be. And they've got to feel that you're going to give them the cold, unvarnished, whole truth. Just think about yourself. If you didn't know this, and whatever job you're in, and I bring you two reports, let's say we're doing North Slope, Alaska, consequences of oil development. I bring you two reports. One has the cover done by the Sierra Club, One has the cover done by the American Petroleum Institute. What's going to be your reaction? Depending on your policy preference, you'll probably say, well, those Sierra Club, a bunch of wacko enviros are all from San Francisco and want to shut down Earth, send us back to the Pleistocene. This is utter trash. Or you might say, American Petroleum Institute, all they want to do is put oil wells in a national mall. Forget it. We're not going to trust their science. But what happens if the science was identical? I would say people still have the same reaction, which means is those are not trusted sources of science. So my argument to agencies is don't end up like the Sierra Club. Don't end up like the American Petroleum Institute. Those are advocacy groups. Science within the agency ought to be policy neutral. And a sobering thing is when you're dealing with policy, democracy, values are all equal. I talked to my barber, who is an avid salmon fisherman. At least in theory, I know more about salmon science than he does. He has very clear-cut policy preferences, like usually it's get away from all government agencies that solve the problem with salmon. But anyway, the point of it is when it comes to values, his values are no better or worse than mine. Conceivably, as a scientist, I know a bit more about science than he does. But values, hey, it's a democracy. Votes all count the same. Problem. The problem is that when you became government scientist, you didn't give up your right to be a citizen. That is a problem. I mean, that is a problem. There's no question about it. And a lot of folks will say, you know, I can hardly stomach it. I've got strong personal policy preferences. I just cannot isolate my science from my policy preferences. Okay, for the rest of the time, I'm going to talk about the second part. Don't become an implicit policy advocate. Now, this is different. People don't really know as your science is being presented that you're an advocate. First, I argue that don't be an implicit advocate because that'll result in scientists just being perceived as another policy advocacy group. Even now, you hear people say, well, the scientists tell me about oil shale development that we ought to do this. Anytime somebody uses oughts, shoulds, we ought to do this, you have moved into advocacy. Scientists should not be perceived to be advocating any particular policy, or you'll just be thrown in with the rest of the advocates. And I think science has too important of a role in democracy for that to happen. Also, slanted science is not easy for most listeners to detect. You can present science in a way that sounds like science, it reads like science, but it's not science. It's really advocacy masquerading as science. And I'll give some examples. And the worst example here is normative science. And normative science, I think, is probably the most pervasive corruption in the science, at least the natural sciences, that I see these days. What is normative science? Normative science is simply information, or what now these days is loosely called science, that is presented, interpreted, or evaluated based on assumed and almost always unstated preference for a particular policy or class of policy choices. And what is that? Using normative science is what? It's simply policy advocacy. It's the exact definition we gave earlier. You're advocating for a particular policy. You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't do that. How does it happen? Well, let's give a case study and tell me how you would avoid this. And let's go back to the California water crisis. The governor calls you in and says, gee, we've heard your great reputation coming from OSU. You're an expert on whatever your topic is. You're going to be part of a team, and that team will assess the consequences of building this proposed dam, which is going to catch snow runoff and store it. Or if you didn't like that one, there's other proposals in California to take dams out, so you can pick and choose. But regardless, we'll focus on the one about building the dam because that's really in the news now. And let's say this team, and it turns out you've been in your career for a while, you head it. And you've got wildlife biologists, fisheries biologists, soil scientists, hydrologists, geologists, every discipline you can think of, and you produce science. And you have figured out the consequences of impounding this river. How would you present those results to the public, to the governor, to the legislature? What kind of words would you use? Well, if you use words like ecosystem degradation, you've moved into advocacy. If you use words like ecosystem improvement, you've moved into advocacy. If you used words like ecosystem alteration, you stuck with science. How can that be? To use degradation, you have to assume that one state is preferred to the other, and going from here to here is degradation, or vice versa, and the same with improvement. You have to make a policy judgment that protecting salmon runs are more important than having great largemouth bass populations, which you'd have here. Or you have to assume that protecting against flooding is more important than having lamprey runs over here. Nothing wrong with either of those policy choices. They're perfectly fine, but they're not science. So anytime you see terms like improvement, degradation, those kinds of things, somebody has assumed a policy preference. Well, let's look at some of those commonly assumed and implicitly assumed policy preferences. What are they? One is, and think about yourself as a scientist, do we assume that unaltered ecosystems, so-called pristine ecosystems, are better than altered? In the extreme case, a mountain wilderness, most people say looks a whole lot better than a Walmart parking lot. That's a policy preference. Scientifically, they're different, but they're not better or worse scientifically. Or native species. We assume native species are preferable to non-native species. Now, scientifically, they're not the same. There's nothing that says, for example, a brook trout, which is from the eastern U.S., is any better or worse than a rainbow trout, which is from the west. They're different, but you have to provide a policy preference to say one is preferred to the other. Now, it's not just the science of natural resources, water, or ecology, or anything else. Let's go over to economic science. There is nothing in economic science that says inherent growth or growth is inherently a good thing. That's a policy position. Economic science and analysis will say, well, if you do this, you're going to maybe have a contraction. Do this, you might have an expansion of growth. But if you apply a value there, like inherent growth is good, you've moved into a policy position. So it's not just the fields we work in that have this challenge. Well, let me give you some examples of normative science. If you're not convinced yet, let me give you some specific examples. Biological diversity. How often, those of you who work in the field, do you just make the assumption that native species are more important? Now, they might be more important politically. Maybe we pass a law that says that's what it is. But that's not the science that makes that determination. It's policy or the public. Society for Conservation Biology, a very large society. I've been active in it for a number of years. They have as one of their tenets right up front that biodiversity is inherently good. Now, I would argue that biodiversity is inherently important, but so is nutrient cycling, structure of function of ecosystem. Lots of things are important. Soil chemistry and so forth. All these things are important. Biological diversity is not inherently good. It may be important to understand how ecosystems work, but it's a policy choice to say it's inherently good. Ecosystem health. I see it pervasively used in the scientific literature, and let's look at that one in more detail. Ecosystem health, biological health, those types of terms. The metaphor is human health. Now, we all know the metaphor with humans. You know, you can basically define at a certain age the characteristics that people have. You know, alive is better than dead, so that's kind of the first course level. And then if you're at this age, you know, you can look at some characteristics and say, yeah, you're reasonably good shape given your age if you have the following characteristics. And medical people are very successful in putting bands around various blood levels and so forth, saying you've got to be within these bounds and you'll be okay. Okay? So the idea is if we could apply this metaphor to ecosystems, biological systems, it could be a very useful idea. I mean, it has a certain appeal. So let's look at it. And let's do a little of analysis and say, well, why do people go with this? One is it's intuitively appealing. It's easy to understand. You can explain it to anybody. Very simple concept. If you understand a human health metaphor, you'll understand ecosystem health metaphor. It's got an apparent scientific basis, so it kind of sounds good. You know, you kind of get a little cachet from the medical community. And also, of course, if it involves scientists, it's kind of the full employment law for scientists because they're going to have to be brought in to decide these issues. But is using the ecosystem health metaphor a fair way to present policy-neutral science? Let's do a little experiment here. Here we have an ecosystem. Happens to be coastal areas down the southeastern U.S. No effects from human activities. This is as, quote, as pristine as you could ever find. There's absolutely no indication that there's been any human effects in this area. Is this a healthy ecosystem? Don't answer out loud. Is this a healthy ecosystem? You don't like that one? Let's go up to Alaska. A lot of small lakes in this area. No indication of human effects. These are as pristine and as pure as you could ever find in North America. Are these healthy ecosystems? Let's go to the Rocky Mountains, northern Rocky Mountains. Perfect lake, no human effects whatsoever. This is, again, as pristine as this lake was, the same as it probably was hundreds of years ago. Let's look around here. Old growth forest. Spotted owls love it. They're plentiful. They're doing great things. This is the perfect old growth habitat. Are these healthy ecosystems? Let's look at this last one in more detail. If we went out and did the studies here, we would find, sure enough, nutrient cycling was the same as we would expect in old growth forests. Spotted owls loved it. Deer and elk hated it because there's very little forage. But it was operating exactly as an old growth forest. Turn 90 degrees. It's been harvested. Did nutrient cycling studies, you'd find, yeah, it's operating exactly what you'd expect after you remove the trees. Spotted owls don't like it at all, but deer and elk love it. Which one is healthier? Now, you all know the answer because you've got your antennae up looking for my trick question here. So you know it's totally dependent on what your policy preference is. If you want to manage a forest for harvest or for deer, for elk, or anything else like that, you want the one in the upper left. And if you don't, you want to protect spotted owls and old trees, the one on the right. You've got to apply a policy preference. There's nothing in the science that will tell you which is better or worse. Now here's the test. Put yourself on somebody walking down the street on the campus here and say, if you did the same test, would these people say the first 4 ecosystems were healthy? And I teach a policy class, and I used to survey people, and 90% of the students would say the first 4 were all healthy. And this is a policy class, so their antennae are kind of up looking for a trick here. My view is, when you talk to people, most people out in the street will say this is unhealthy and this is healthy. They presupposed a policy preference. Okay, why are you worrying about this? This is kind of esoteric. How's it going to affect me? Is it just sloppy? Yeah, maybe it's sloppy intellectually, but it's really harmless. I think it is sloppy intellectually. I don't think there's any question about that, but it's not harmless. First of all, and the main reason I think it's not harmless, because in a democracy, we assume that the public makes the choices between values, competing values. The public adjudicates that, maybe through the legislature, maybe through laws or whatever, but it's not the technical experts. Let's look more carefully. When you use normative science, if you use it, whose values are being used in normative science? Who makes those choices? Now, political science will say it's the elite. Who are the elite when normative science is used? This is not rhetorical. This is the question. Who are the elite? Business, academics, oil companies, Sierra Club. I see waving here, yes. People can afford what? People who can afford lobbyists. That's a good point. Okay. Well, I think there's a simpler test. Normative science is done by scientists. Okay. Let me ask a question, and this does require a show of hands. How many people get their news from National Public Radio? Yes, almost 100%. Let me tell you an interesting observation. Real people don't listen to NPR. They listen to something else. So what does that tell you? The demographic for NPR is the same demographic that does normative science. They're college educated. They tend to have, at least they're more likely to have, science degrees than the general public. They tend to be of across the political spectrum, a particular part of the political spectrum. These are the people whose values are used in normative science. The people who practice science, people like us, If I'm doing an analysis of what is healthy, I will presuppose my values of what is healthy into it, just like you are. If you look at that reservoir that's being constructed in your own mind, you'll say, well, I actually kind of prefer dams or lakes to free-flowing, or vice versa. I kind of prefer salmon to bass. I kind of prefer deer to spotted owls. You make your policy preferences when you incorporate concepts of health and normative values into science. Okay, let me wrap up the last few minutes with how do you get out of this woods. Okay? Let me give you what I think are the 3 key hallmarks that I've used over the last few years to present science in a way that doesn't lead people down the wrong path. And imagine yourself in this role presenting to a group of policymakers. First thing, first rule, understand framing. This is not, how you're going to put your artwork in a nice little box. It's not how you build a house square. We're talking here about policy framing. The basic issue here is, how do you frame a question? And let's use the example, my favorite example, salmon policy. Case study. A number of years ago here at the LaSalle Stewart Center, we had one of thousands of salmon policy meetings about what you're going to do about this, that, or the other thing, and there were about 20 of us. And we were talking about some issue about salmon, which I've totally forgotten about, and going on and on about it. And there was another conference going on at the same time, and it was a conference about affordable housing. Now, we were typical government employees. We probably, if we even had a break, a coffee break, we had to go out and get our own coffee, and so we might have had maybe sprung for a cup of coffee on a table for our breaks. But they had great breaks. They had muffins and juice and all kinds of good things. So we would amble over there and kind of mooch off their table and act like we were part of the affordable housing dialogue, and there were 400 of them, so it was easy to do, and we were kind of nondescript government scientists. It became pretty clear when you listen to these affordable housing people is we were a constraint. They wanted to drive the price of housing down in the Willamette Valley, and all we talked about was additional regulations to protect salmon habitat, which was buildable property. Now, it's not politically correct to say we're against salmon, but what is politically correct is to say all these government constraints are driving the cost of housing up, and if we just didn't have all these constraints, we would have more cheap housing. So the take-home message is who says salmon recovery is more important than affordable housing, or vice versa? That's a political decision, not a scientific one. Rule 2, be honest. Don't lie, cheat, and steal. And I'll assume if you got that far. But the key thing is tell the whole truth. And let me give you an example of this. I especially used to spend a lot of time reviewing various salmon recovery programs. Okay? We're going to do this over the next 10 years, spend all this money, do all these kind of things. We're going to recover wild salmon. Spend $1 billion a year. Is it going to work? And you'd ask people to develop these recovery plans, and I know them all. They're good personal friends, known them for years. What is your assumption about the human population growth in the Northwest through this century? Well, gee, we don't really have one. We really haven't thought about this. And then you say, well, okay, let's talk about this for a minute. Right now in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, British Columbia, 3 states, 1 province, there are roughly 15 million people, 2009. By the end of this century, in these 3 states, 1 province, we'll have how many people, based on best current guesses? Yeah, there's a range. But the range is someplace between 60 and 110 million. Quadrupling is the low end. Okay? Most of it's immigration. So, current population is 15. It would seem reasonable that you'd say, as you develop a salmon recovery program, you'd say, well, it's got to work when the population is 50 or 75 million. So when you ask people doing salmon recovery programs in government, you say, what population do you assume? And they assume more or less level. That's not the whole truth. And you say, well, will it work if you have 65 million people in the Northwest? Not a prayer. Not a prayer. That's the government, they're not scientists, they're basically policy people. In my view, that's not telling the whole truth. So, salmon recovery, the example there is, you can't hide behind saying, well, no one asked that question. As a scientist, you need to come up with the inconvenient truth and say, this is the consequence. This will happen. If this projection is true, this is going to happen. The final rule, stick to science. Watch for your hidden policy preferences and avoid normative science. And going back to the example we talked about dam building removal, hey, there's lots of good policy reasons to take dams out, and there's lots of good policy reasons to leave dams in. None of them are scientific. They all have consequences, but none of those reasons, pro or con, are scientific. Final two thoughts. You'll probably find yourself at some point in your career, especially towards the latter part, as a policymaker, a user of science. As a user of science, a person who's listening to sciences, don't let scientists get out of control and use normative science or other types of subtle advocacy. Keep that bound. So the loss of credibility in science is too important to everybody in society to let it be lost. On the other side, which you're more likely to be in most of your career, when you're providing sciences, stick to the clear-cut definition of science and don't slip into policy advocacy.